Here are 5 tips on how to use third-party test prep books for the SAT and the ACT. In today's episode of Just Pick C, I want to talk about how best to use third-party practice materials for the SAT, the ACT, or really any test, whether it's a subject test or whatever test you might be taking, but focusing specifically on the SAT and the ACT. This is not going to be a video about the books that I recommend. That will be a different video, a different resource down the line. I just want to talk about today, once you've picked the book or resource that you're going to use, how do you use it in the most effective way? What should you do and what should you not do when using that resource to best prep for the SAT or the ACT? Before we get into the 5 tips, let me define what I mean by third-party test prep. By third-party test prep, I mean any book, practice problem, practice test, practice resources, really anything produced for the SAT or ACT by a third party. In other words, by a company or by a tutor, for example, by me. That's not by the College Board, the maker of the SAT, or ACT Inc., maker of the ACT, right? So these are your Princeton Review books, your Kaplan books, your Barron's books, books by independent tutors, materials and practice questions by me, any type of question or practice test made by anyone other than the official test makers. And again, I'm not going to be in this video talking about the books or resources that I think are the best, though of course I can't resist but to give in a plug for my courses and resources, but beyond that, that will be for a different video. I want to talk about third-party tests and third-party practice materials because they're often misused by students. When you look at how the SAT or the ACT, the College Board, and ACT Inc., how they make those tests, it takes them years and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to make every single practice or every single test that they eventually administer to students. When you look at third-party companies like Princeton Review or Barron's or even me, I guarantee you, do not nearly go through as much time and effort and money creating our materials as the College Board and ACT do. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. We don't have the resources to do that, and that's not really the point of what we're trying to do. The problem comes in when the materials created by third parties are given the same importance and are used as if they were real materials. And that's what the 5 tips are going to be about. How can you use third-party books, practice tests in the right way so that you're helping your prep and you're not making mistakes using that material that could actually be hurting your test prep process. Tip number 1 is to use real SATs and ACTs made by the test makers as the core of your study process. So whether you're using them for timed sections, for full-time tests, or even to practice certain question types, real tests made by the College Board and by ACT Inc. should be at the core of your study process. These tests are so valuable that we really want to make sure we get everything out of them. So whether you are studying for the SAT or ACT, you should make sure to get every drop of value out of those tests. So you should take those practice sections and tests timed, check your answers, review each question, and then I often recommend later down the line, a few weeks or months later, redo those tests, if not timed, at least redo the questions, just to make sure that you fully understand them. So you should be making practice tests, practice questions that are from real sources, the primary part of your study program. And especially with the ACT, you may not even need to touch a third-party book when it comes to their practice tests or practice questions. Maybe you would need a third-party book or course for strategy, but when it comes down to actual questions, you might be able to make do just with real material, especially when it comes to the ACT. So really make real materials the major thing that you focus on and you practice with during your study program. If you're working with a tutor or in a course that uses third-party material like Barron's or Kaplan or whatever as the core of their practice, I would very highly recommend and encourage you to rethink that class or that tutor, or maybe ask the tutor to use real materials, because if a tutor, for example, is not using real materials, something is wrong, because they should know they've got to use real practice questions, real practice tests as the core of studying. Now, as we're going to talk about, there are uses for third-party material, but most of the time you should be working on real questions and real tests. Tip number 2, building off of what we just talked about in tip number 1, never, ever, ever use third-party tests as full-timed practice tests And especially, even if you do that, do not trust the scores that they give you. So if you say, I took a practice Barron's SAT test and I got a 1400, whatever, in my mind, that's a meaningless number because, again, Barron's and other, I'm not picking on Barron's, it's every company, including, tutors like me. We are not spending years and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, developing these tests. The ACT and the SAT are, because they need to make sure their tests are, fancy word, psychometrically valid and reliable. In other words, they have to make sure that their test actually tests what it purports to test. Otherwise, colleges wouldn't want it. I guarantee you, Princeton Review, ACT, me, we're not doing that. Now again, there's nothing wrong with that. We just have to realize that that's the case and we can't use the tests in the way that we might think we should. So you shouldn't be using full tests, time tests from third parties. You shouldn't certainly be trusting any numbers or scores they give you because those tables are basically useless. The only scores you should trust are from real practice tests, and of course, when you take a real test, those are the numbers you can trust. But don't use third-party tests as full tests. That's not really what they should be designed for, and really companies, I think, should be more honest about how and why those tests are created and how they should be used. And that's what I'm trying to do in this video. So what can third-party books and practice tests be used for? This gets into tip number 3. They should be used for targeted practice. So what's really useful about books, courses, resources that create practice questions and practice tests is you can focus on topics, concepts, strategies in a targeted way. So if you're, for example, the main flaw with doing practice test after practice test for the SAT or the ACT, even if they are real tests, is you're not really getting the chance to hone in and do, 15 problems about this algebra topic, or 10 problems about comma splices, or whatever it may be, right? You're doing practice test after practice test, but you're not able to really focus in on your weak points, as well as you would be able to if you're using a third-party book or resource that says, okay, here's a chapter about triangles. Okay, so here are some triangle problems, or here's a chapter about some ACT science topic. Here are some problems related to that. That is the value of third-party books. Now again, within books and resources, some books and resources are better than others, and I'll have another video eventually about what I consider, beyond my own resources, my own courses, what I consider to be valuable and useful, but they should be used that way and that way only, as targeted practice. That said, tip number 4 is not every test and section should be treated equally when it comes to third-party tests. What do I mean by this? So for example, math is pretty easy, speaking from experience, it's pretty easy for tutors, test prep companies to make practice math questions. For example, one of the things we do is we go to real tests and we reskin them. We just put on different numbers, different words, but it's really testing the same concept. So it's not that different from the kinds of questions you'll see on the SAT or the ACT. It's relatively straightforward to do that. It's relatively easy to come up with a bank of 20 questions about triangles or about logs or whatever the case may be. So math actually is quite good most of the time across the board when you're looking at third-party books and third-party tests. Again, you don't want to use them as practice tests, but they can be really valuable as targeted practice. So for example, in my math courses, I produce practice questions about topics to help you learn the strategies, the ideas, the concepts, whatever it might be, in a targeted way. Not to say, oh, okay, if you get these questions right, you've got an 800. It's not like that at all, but in a targeted fashion, it can really help. When you're looking at something like writing, grammar, ACT English, it's a little bit trickier. Sometimes the questions are not quite accurate. They go a little bit too far in a certain grammar rule. They test something that's not actually on the SAT or ACT, or maybe their questions are a little bit too ambiguous. They're two choices that are actually a little bit too close, and the SAT or ACT wouldn't make you make that choice. But by and large, writing in English, pretty easy to make practice questions for. Again, you have a concept, you skin a question, reskin a question from an SAT or an ACT, or you just make questions based on that concept. Pretty straightforward. When you get into the passage-based questions, this is where you start having significant issues. So ACT science, generally it depends on the quality of the passage ultimately. So if they can come up with really quality practice passages, it's not too hard to create questions pretty similar to the ACT. Not perfect, but pretty good. You can use ACT Science third-party resources to really just get practice in data analysis, practice in understanding the scientific method. All that stuff works pretty okay. I wouldn't say it's as good across the board as, say, English and math, primarily because you can't really trust the timing. The challenge of the ACT science test is the rush you're in. And no third-party book is really going to be able to simulate that too well. Now, where the problem really comes in is reading. There are very few resources that are frankly even worth doing practice questions out of, much less ever using them as full practice tests. Reading is really hard to get right, whether you're looking at the SAT or the ACT. You have to make sure the passages are of the appropriate difficulty and diversity. You've got to make sure the questions are the types of questions you would see on the test, and most significantly, that the answer choices are fair. What you see too often in third-party resources is the answer choices are way too close. There's way too many ambiguous questions, way too much ambiguity in the choices. It's just not accurate at all. The reading is really hard to get right. So more or less, any third-party reading you should not even do as practice because it's just too hard to get it correct. You can, so when I make practice reading questions, I'm using them for very targeted reasons. So I'm not saying at all that these are supposed to be like accurate representations of real questions, like that you should trust them as a measure of how you're doing as measured by the SAT or ACT when it comes to reading. I make questions for really specific targeted purposes. So if you can find materials like that, then I think it's okay. But certainly as like full passages, full tests for reading, third-party material is very, very poor. I also should make a comment about Khan Academy. I think Khan Academy as a resource for the SAT follows a lot of what I said. Their math stuff is fine, maybe occasionally a little bit off from what you'd see on the real test, even though allegedly the College Board is helping them with the questions. I don't think it's as hands-on as it seems, but the math stuff is mostly pretty good. The grammar stuff, mostly pretty good. But again, the reading, it's just too hard to get right. I've had so many problems working through that reading material. I don't really trust it very well. So as extra practice, I guess it's fine, but you really want to stick, when it comes to reading especially, for SAT or ACT, with real reading material, because that's where you're going to get the closest representation, of course, of what you're going to see on test day with reading tests. And it's really not trivial to get that right. So you need to make sure you're using real materials whenever you can for that reason. And the last tip number 5, is to use third-party books as sources of strategy, because that's really where third-party books, courses, etc. are really going to shine. Certainly the practice questions and targeted practice and all that stuff is useful, but you're not going to get any kind of decent strategy from the College Board or from the ACT Inc., right? They're not going to teach you the weaknesses of their tests. They're not going to teach you how to beat the tests in certain ways or be efficient time efficient in other ways. They're not going to tell you that, right? They are going to be very straightforward with how they think you should take the test. And some of that advice is good, but a lot of it isn't. So third-party test prep books, courses, tutors, people like me, that's what we do. We tell you, okay, here are the most effective ways we think there are to approach the tests. Don't listen to the College Board, don't listen to the ACT Inc. Do it this way or do it that way. Now, that said, shop around, because there are many different opinions across tests about what the best way is to approach the tests, and a lot of that is because it's personal. A lot of times it depends on your strengths, your weaknesses, your likes, your dislikes, about what strategies might actually be helpful for you versus another person. I, for example, have a set of strategies for all the tests that I think are very effective. Track experience with students shows that they're effective. I have reasons why I think they're effective compared to other strategies, but in the end, you have to experiment. You have to try out different approaches, see what works for you, and that only comes from practice. And I do want to add, be careful about the marketing here of third-party test prep from any source, right? Be skeptical always, even be skeptical of me, because in the end, there's no magic bullet that will suddenly, like if I tell you a thing, if I tell you a strategy, that's not going to suddenly make you go from a 1,000 to a 1,600 or from a 23 to a 36. That's not possible. And anybody who says that it is not being truthful. Certainly there are strategies that are more effective than others, and I think my strategies are super effective. But that said, you have to put in the work, you got to put in the time, you have to see what works best for you, and that's what's going to get you the improvements and the gains. So those are the 5 tips. I hope they helped. Feel free to leave a comment below if you have any questions or comments about this. In my next video, I'm going to talk about what you should do when and if you run out of practice tests for the SAT or the ACT. And this is especially an issue with the SAT because it's relatively a new test, and because there's just not many practice tests they've released yet. it's very easy to run out of practice material for that. So I'm going to talk about in a future video, probably the next one, what you should do when you run out of SATs, what resources you might want to use as extra practice material, given what we talked about in this video. So let me know if you have any comments or questions. Feel free to comment below. Check the link in the description if you'd like to see the article version of this, and I hope to hear from you soon. All right, see you in the next episode. To learn more about Reason Prep's SAT, SAT subject test, and ACT video courses, go to reasonprep.com/enroll, and you can find the link in the description below the video.